So welcome everybody in person here in Vienna and at home at your screens, wherever you are, to this closing event of our ERC Starting Grant project, The Value of Mothers to Society. Between 2016 and 2021, an interdisciplinary team of researchers set out to investigate motherhood and mothering practices in prehistoric Europe. So after 5 intensive years of research, I would like to review our highlights from the last 5 years, reflect a little bit on the lessons we learned, and look at the new research opportunities that have opened up through our research. And of course, we're also here today to celebrate a little bit our success. So I'll begin by giving a little bit of background on this project. And I'm very happy that some team members are here today and present their own contributions. So my interest in researching motherhood in prehistory had 2 roots. One was my interest in gender and the human body in the Bronze and Iron Ages. And second, of course, my own transition to motherhood played a role with the pregnancy and birth with my first born son, Daniel, in 2012. And I received funding from the FEF for a pilot project, The Social Status of Motherhood in Bronze Age Europe in 2014. And then I received the starting grant in 2015. So the core idea of this project was to investigate social responses to pregnancy, birth, and early childrearing in prehistoric societies, and to relate the social to the reproductive status of prehistoric women. Taking motherhood as a separate identity category that's distinct from gender, I wanted to know if and how women's social status changed as they became mothers, and how motherhood was conceptualized in the past. Taking a long-term history approach, we analyzed changes in family structures and gender relations from the late Neolithic to the early Iron Ages in Central Europe. And we aimed to combine the latest information in science with new interpretive approaches. From the start, it was also clear that the project had a political dimension, because raising small children and work life are often incompatible, and there's a lot of debate how to best support working mothers in their careers and at the same time provide optimal substitute care for babies and small children. And I was very fed up by all these naive narratives of prehistoric and natural child rearing that are frequently misused as political arguments. And yet there were so few facts available, so little reliable science-based information on motherhood and childrearing practices. So we set out to change this, and I believe we succeeded in many ways. Motherhood in prehistory has now moved from being a fringe interest to being an accepted topic in archaeology and anthropology, which attracts plenty of scholarly and public interest. And through this, it also demonstrates the relevance of archaeology and long-term history to current debates. The leading hypothesis was that first, women had to give, that have given birth was socially defined differently from other women. Second, that their social status changed if and when they became mothers. And 3, that social responses to reproductive success or failure were culturally contingent. It has been frequently assumed that the ability to reproduce contributed to women's status, which may then be reflected somehow in the funerary practice. But there was very little research in how this mechanism are related to the reality of lives lived. So the first objective of the project was to investigate motherhood as a social phenomenon, as social expectations for women varied throughout prehistory. In the burial record, we see differences between women expressing grave goods. In art, we see people of different sexual and social characterizations. So we asked if all women became mothers or if certain women were selected for reproduction, if some were subject to reproductive control or had the choice to remain child-free. We evaluated the risks and consequences of giving birth, bearing in mind that even today, maternal and infant mortality is very strongly linked to social status. Access to food, the ability to rest after childbirth, and involvement in decision-making are factors that directly affect maternal and infant mortality, even in the absence of modern medical science. So we aim to differentiate different kinds of female biographies in prehistory Women in the past are often imagined to go through exactly the same stages of life, from baby to girl, from mother to grandmother. And we have pointed out that there are very many different ways women's lives look like, and many of them relate to their reproductive histories. So this is actually one of the first conferences that we organized in Clement in 2016, together with Peter Ramsel, who's also here. That we looked at multiple femininities and multiple masculinities, different kinds of male and female identities. To understand the value of reproductive success, we must, of course, look at childrearing practices. The feeding babies and small children is a large part of the mother-infant relationship, and a part that we can also investigate archaeologically quite well. So we looked at breastfeeding, at weaning, and at substitutes for breast milk. Investigating children's treatment after death and how they were buried, let us evaluate reproductive success. Children's treatment after death and their grave goods can tell us more about their lives and positions in society. And later on, we focused specifically on sex-based differences in the way girls and boys were treated. So in order to juxtapose women's status and role in society with the likelihood that they were mothers, we first needed to develop ways to identify mothers. So one strand of our research was dedicated to working on the skeletal pelvis to identify and understand the factors that contribute to pelvic shape changes and bone reactions that might relate to pregnancies and birth. So I knew from the beginning that it was a very controversial topic and that it wouldn't be easy, but developing methods to read the female pelvis has actually turned out to be one of the most challenging as well as interesting parts of this project. Doris Pany-Kucera and Michaela Fritzl recorded more than 400 prehistoric skeletons, worked with documented collections and anatomical specimens. Lukas Waltenberger, who wrote his PhD in the course of this project, used morphometric modeling and clinical CT data for new insights. So they will now report about their own research.
Okay, so hello and welcome everybody from my side too. In the anthropological part of the project, we tried to shed light on prehistoric women's obstetric histories, which has been a long-standing objective in bioarchaeology. Despite considerable efforts to relate the formerly called scars of parturition to obstetric events, the context remained vague. Therefore, I have to admit that I was rather skeptical from the anthropological part of view when Katharina first came up with the project idea. However, being a young mother myself at that time, I liked the idea and I was curious if this could work. Therefore, my colleague Michaela Fritzl and I started to assess skeletal alterations at pelvic bones when the project was granted. We recorded the classic pelvic features, among them the well-known preauricular sulcus, which you can see here, dorsal pubic pitting, and the extended pubic tubercle in over 400 prehistoric individuals. In the course of the VAMOS project, we were especially interested in the shapes and combinations of these pelvic features in females. However, pelvic features vary between individuals and populations and may be influenced by a variety of factors from body height to body size, the shapes of pelvis and femur, age, pathological conditions and injuries, as well as environmental, hormonal and genetic factors that are poorly understood. Anyway, we attempted to have a closer look at the prehistoric bones, starting with the case studies unter Hotzenthal and Schleimbach, which allowed us to develop our methodology. Concurrently, it was clear to us that we would hardly make progress with this topic from the skeletal perspective alone. There's an urgent need for clarifying the underlying anatomical structures of the features and getting a better insight into medical basics, especially from the female organism. We approached this goal within the working group called Pelvis and Evolution, where a group of scientists and clinicians working on pelvic issues from different perspectives reassembled regularly for inspiring and fruitful discussions and collaborations. Meanwhile, our detailed osteological work led to the observation of new features in the skeletons of our pilot studies. We first described changes occurring at the ventral sacral margin and later termed sacral preauricular extensions, which you can see here, and corresponding iliac changes, and later the sacral preauricular notches. I don't want to go into more detail here. What is important is that we developed a systematic scoring system for recording these changes and introduced it into the literature. As we found the changes only in female skeletons, a possible association with pregnancy and childbirth-related issues was considered. But missing parity information on prehistoric individuals made it impossible to draw reliable conclusions between the extensions, notches we described, and pregnancies or parturitions. Therefore, the study of the described features in identified skeletal collections with known age, sex, age at death, and information on obstetric histories of the individuals was indicated. This was given for the selected collections in London and Geneva. We hypothesized that SPE and SPN occur in parous females. In total, we assessed 70 female individuals and selected males for comparison. The on-site examination was performed blind for the obstetric data. In the analyzed subsamples, only females, and within those, only parous females who had 2 or more children presented a SPE. The oldest small extension here. The frequency of occurrence, however, was rather low, with about 6 to 10%. But a significant association was found between the presence of an SPE and having the first child by 25 years, as well as having 2 or more children by the age of 25 years. The SPN was also found only in multiparous females in the samples, with a frequency of about 4%. The interesting thing here was that the affected females were among those with the highest numbers of children, and it was only 2 females. They both had twins in their 20s, and the first births were around 20 years. No respective changes were found in the males. However, as you can see here, not all the females show this pattern. To explain what I mean with a pattern is, we also tried to quantify the assessed features, and we developed a specific formula to calculate the so-called pelvic pattern index. We had observed that some women display a pelvic pattern, which is specific combinations of pronouns as expressions of pelvic features. But in this case, you can see here the number of children of 2 females. In yellow, the one had 15 children, and in the green line, 11 children. And then the 10 features we assessed with these different expressions. And the woman in the yellow row had something that we call a pelvic pattern. She has a well-expressed preauricular sulcus and other features, resulting in a pelvic pattern index of 61%. And the other woman who had 11 children, which is comparable to 15, I think, does not show a pattern. She has no changes at the pelvis, resulting in a pelvic pattern index of only 10. To conclude, the SPE and SPN detected in the prehistoric collections may indeed be indicators of motherhood. In the identified collections, as I showed, all females who presented a pelvic pattern of at least 4 distinctly expressed pelvic features were parturient. Moreover, the presence of an SPE and dorsal pits was associated with age at first birth up to 25 years. Nullipare and males never showed a pelvic pattern. But as you saw, not all the women expressed this pattern. It may, though, therefore be possible to identify at least a part of the parous women in the skeletal collections with the proposed PPI method. The findings suggest that some individuals or groups may be affected by more favorable combinations of feto-pelvic proportions for giving birth than others, resulting from the interplay of parental genetic makeover, dietary, epigenetic, environmental, and biomechanical factors. In 2019, we organized an interdisciplinary conference on female pelvic features at the Natural History Museum with wonderful contributions, and we published a range of papers on the topic, including the current special issue of the Journal of biological and clinical anthropology, anthropologischer Anzeiger, including 9 contributions to the meeting. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lukas Waltenberger. In the next few minutes, I want to present my research on pelvic features, which I conducted as my PhD dissertation. I used a multi-red approach, including geometric morphometrics, which I applied on these 3 samples here. A 19th century anatomical collection from Austria with some background information available, a small sample from Bronze Age Austria, and a recent sample containing forensic CT scanning data from the New Mexico Dissident Image Database, for which detailed obstetrical recordings were available. So I used photogrammetry to obtain 3D surface meshes of the articulated human pelvis of dry bone material, and I semi-automatically segmented the CT scanning data using the software Mirror. On these 3D surface meshes, I quantitatively and qualitatively evaluated the shape and size of pelvic features. In this sample, you can see the expression of dorsal pubic pitting of one individuum. And I also placed more than 330 landmarks at all important anatomical structures on the pelvis to obtain pelvic shape. So I published 4 articles about pelvic features for my dissertation. 2 of them I want to quickly present in this talk here. Both focuses on the clinical CT scanning data from New Mexico. The first one is about age-dependent changes of pelvic shape during adulthood. So pelvic features become deeper over lifetime. So as I suspected, biomechanical stress associated with pelvic shape is one cause factor. By applying a moving average algorithm and principal component analysis on the landmark configurations, I could define 3 different phases of pelvic shape change in females, which you can see here. One phase between 20 to 40 years of age. Then there's a shift in the pattern. So there's a second phase from 40 to 50 years of age, representing the time around menopause, and the post-menopausal phase after 50 years of age. By using multivariate regression, I could visualize the shape changes. Here, for example, the shape changes associated with the first phase, so the reproductive phase in females. Here you can see that the pelvic inlet become relatively wider in medial lateral direction. The pubic body shifts towards superior and anterior, and also the sacral curvature decreased. So all features increasing the birth canal and therefore supporting an easygoing birth. This is likely associated with hormonally induced bone remodeling due to estrogens. Another explanation could be ligament laxity due to relaxing during birth, but also a decrease of the bone mineral density in the pelvis due to a high calcium need during pregnancy and lactation is also plausible. Interestingly, also pelvic features are strongly associated with age in individuals during their reproductive time. This association completely vanished after menopause, just the variability of the pelvic features expression increased. So what I did next, I want to find cause factors which explained the development of pelvic features. So I used multiple regression modeling and path modeling. One example you can see here for which partially explains the development of dorsal pubic pitting. These arrows and numbers represents the path coefficients, standardized path coefficients, which describe the direct effect of these 4 variables: age, birth, weight, and height on the development of dorsal pubic pitting independent of each other. So you can see that the path coefficients of weight and stature are small, so negligible. Whereas age and birth both have a significant effect on the development of dorsopubic pitting. Namely, the effect of births is more than 3 times larger than the effect of age on dorsopubic pitting. So that's very good. So now we can say, one can say dorsopubic pitting is a true patrician skull. So next I used dorsopubic pitting to develop a birth prediction model, which you can see here. So the red dotted line represents the 95% prediction bands and the gray area, the 95% confidence bands for the mean number of births. Unfortunately, this model is quite imprecise for a single prediction. For example, if I have a woman with a dorsopubic pitting score of 1, using this prediction model, it's possible to estimate between 0 to 4.6 birth events for this woman. So nearly every woman nowadays would fall into this prediction range. However, this method is still suitable for the birth predictions in groups. So it's possible to estimate the birth rates in different populations or in individuals of different archaeological sites and estimate the mean number of births. In this case, the predicted number of births just deviates half a birth from the true number of births. And with this, I want to end my presentation and give the word back to Katharina.
These are the papers that Lukas published. Hauzenthal in Lower Austria served as the first case study in which we detailed our approach. And at this cemetery, we found absolutely no correlation between what we then called parity index and the summary of all pelvic features and the social index of buried individuals based on grave constructions and grave goods. What we did find, however, was a relatively young age for first motherhood and very interesting insights into the social relationships of buried individuals. So in cooperation with Walter Parson from the Legal Medicine in Innsbruck, we tested the mitochondrial DNA of co-buried individuals, as at the time this seemed the best approach to find mother-child relationships. We demonstrated that these 2- and 6-year-old co-buried children were closely maternally related, and they might even have been siblings. The way they were buried suggests a very strong emotional bond, close kinship relations. We found another possible sibling pair in the triple burial from Hauzenthal, where a 35 to 40-year-old woman was buried with 2 children, a 3-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. So the woman was buried in flexed position on the right side of the body. The small girl was placed facing face to face and covered by a bowl, and the boy was snuggled behind her knees. And we were quite surprised to see that in that case, the children were not maternally related to the woman. So the age gap perhaps just allowed her to be a paternal grandmother, but of course other relations such as wet nurses are possible. But still, I wouldn't hesitate to call this woman a mother in the social sense. Kinship is not the same as biological relatedness, and these examples exemplify why it's so important to look at the archaeological context of the burials rather than just investigating the DNA from human remains in isolation. So the methods and tools of ancient DNA analysis have evolved so rapidly, even during the 5 years of the project, that we were quite lucky to actually leave the more detailed kinship analysis to the end. We are currently collaborating with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, who promised to detect relatedness up to the 9th generation. And it will be really fascinating to see how all these individuals on a case study are related, and if we can find relationships from one cemetery to the other. We also organized a conference on genes, isotopes, and artifacts in 2018 in Vienna with over 100 international participants. This was pre-COVID times, so people were actually coming together in real life. It was a really exciting event. Another one of the early Bronze Age cemeteries we worked on was Schleimbach near Vienna, a site with a particular high prevalence of evidence for interpersonal conflict and violence. There was also the site where we first implemented the revolutionary new method of sexing the remains of buried children via sex-specific peptides in dental enamel. We were presented with a child that was excavated in 1981 from a storage pit, already half destroyed by the building works. The child was found on top of a 10 centimeter fill layer with a grinding stone and an early Bronze Age loom weight in the same layer. The skull of the child shows no fewer than 4 blunt force traumas. Interesting about the child is also the pathological condition. Not only was this child very small for its age, but it most likely suffered badly from middle ear infections. And these were quite painful and might have made the child cry a lot, driving the parents mad. It's also possible that a loss of hearing was associated with the condition, which might have made communication difficult and the child a social outcast. So in that particular case, it was really important to know the child's sex for interpreting this find, because in conflicts between groups of patriarchal organization, girls and women are more likely to be captured and integrated in other groups, whereas boys and men are more likely to be killed. So it was one of the really good case study to start with. And with the help of Fabian Kanz from the Legal Medicine Department, we built a cooperation with Christopher Gerner and his students from the Analytical Chemistry Department to implement a recently published protocol of testing sex-specific peptides in dental enamel with nanoflow liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry. And the advantage of this method over ancient DNA analysis is that it doesn't depend on the preservation of nuclear DNA. It's very difficult to contaminate and relatively cost-effective and quick to do, although the underlying bioinformatics and formulating answers to the second reviewer's questions can cause some headaches. Crucially, the method is minimally destructive and the tested area on the tooth is hardly visible after the procedure. So we did indeed find out that this child that we tested was a boy. And we followed up with another case study on the cemetery of Franzhausen in Lower Austria. Here we had 75 children that we could test for sex-specific peptides in the dental enamel. And we found an extremely good correspondence between the sex of the buried child and the gendered way in which the children are placed. So this is an early Bronze Age community that draws a very sharp distinction between men and women. Men are buried on the left side of the body with the head to the north. Women on the right side of the body with the head to the south. And this is apparently also the case for children, more or less from birth. We only found one exception of a small girl that was buried in a sort of male-like manner. And that's also interesting because if you look at the adult data, for which we only have morphological information, then it's a little bit more likely for women to not have to follow these strongly gendered rules than for men. And this apparently is also the case for children. So our hope was, our hope that we might be able to use this method in cremated teeth as well, as a large part of the project also focused on late Bronze Age case studies for which cremating the body after death was the norm. So Michaela Fritzl took on the task of investigating the cemetery of Inzersdorf. Sadly, this little experiment with the peptide-based sexing didn't work, but we're still working on Inzersdorf.
So hello and thank you. The Urnfeld Cemetery of Inzersdorf of the Traisen is situated in the lower Traisen Valley, close to the Traisen-Danube confluence. It was a rather rough rescue excavation, which caused the strange artificial shape of the cemetery. All in all, it contained 273 graves, and the graves are either long rectangular, these are considered to be the oldest graves of the cemetery, or round to irregular, these are the younger ones. Most of the shallow pits contained urn burials, but some with scattered cremations were also recorded. All in all, 1 square and 11 circular ditches surrounding 1 or 2 of the graves have been identified. These ditches have been interpreted as lining the boundaries of burial mounds, but no other evidence of burial mounds has been found. This part here is a Latine period cemetery, so we can ignore this for now. For my master thesis, I worked on the 23 multiple burials of Inzersdorf. And the urn graves, I can tell that the graves where the urns contained both individuals, like such as this one, is the most common type. Within these, a tendency towards a combination of women and child can be detected. Graves where the urn contained 1 individual, while the second individual was found next to the urn, such as this one, is the second largest category. Here also women and child combinations are predominant, with the female situated within the urn and the child next to the urn, except in one situation, the case it is reversed. If the urn contained 1 individual and the second individual was found above the urn, as it was within this grave, it is always a man inside the urn and a female or an older child above the urn. For the other categories, such as this one, where 2 individuals were situated in their own vessels side by side, or the 3 multiple burials within the long rectangular graves, the number is too small to identify regularities. For the graves within a circular ditch, this was 2 times the case. There are only children and children combinations. So all in all, the by far most frequent combination is that of women and child, by far, and then there's a large gap, and then man and child, women and man and child combinations are the minority. So the combination of individuals support the theory that they were connected by tight social relations / family ties / households that on one hand might result in deaths at the same time, maybe caused by accidents, disease, death during pregnancy or birth or something like that. And on the other hand, the social relations may be depicted in a way those individuals were buried in more or less strict rules, as the nature of cremation allows combinations of individuals, even if they do not die at the same time. And for my PhD, I started to look at the whole cemetery, and here especially at the question of mobility and connectivity. My research was delayed by my maternity leave, so I can only give preliminary results here. So given the location of the cemetery and assessment of the graves and grave goods, various kinds of mobility and connectivity can be expected, such as long-term or seasonal migration, residence change upon marriage, travel, trade, or just social visits. And because of that, some questions arise. So like, how do foreign influences, goods, or raw materials arrive at Inzersdorf? How well is Inzersdorf situated compared to contemporary sites? Which kinds of mobility can be detected and can they be linked to certain identities? And subsequently, what does this tell us about the community? So, but how do we detect mobility and connectivity? Well, the first and easiest way is through traditional archaeological techniques, so where we can look at foreign goods and influences, then also through network analysis, which is a method to assess connectivity and interaction rather than movement as such, through trace element analysis and the analysis of raw materials of the bronze and silex artifacts. Here we can maybe detect craft shops, production units, and of course raw material procurement. Last but not least, strontium isotope analysis. With the strontium ratios of human tissues compared to that of the surrounding environment, we can show if individuals were locusts or not. And that I want to show you right now. Together with Christoph Snook, we have analyzed 104 individuals so far. And here we strive to sample the bones with the longest turnover rates to get a signal as far in the past of an individual as possible to catch as many outliers as possible. So mathematically, only 2 outliers can be identified. The data may suggest more, but from this level of investigation, they cannot be confirmed. Surprisingly, the two definitive outliers are children, and this I want to show you closer. The first outlier I wanted to show you is the lower outlier, that one. And this is the second individual in a double barrel. The other individual is well within the local range, and the non-local is a subadult and was the only individual associated with a bronze casting mold and what might be a semi-finished artifact. This might indicate some kind of metal-related mobility, maybe some kind of knowledge transfer, maybe something like an apprenticeship or such. And the other outlier, that is that one, is an individual within a single burial and also a child. This is one of the very earliest graves of Inzersdorf, which might hint at a cemetery founding by newcomers. So there are many interesting prospects and expectations here, and the research is still ongoing. And with that, I want to hand the word back to Katharina.
The way in which different gender and age groups participate in mobility is a really hot topic right now. So it's been demonstrated time and again that women have much more mobility than originally thought. And much of this mobility might also relate to marriage, intermarriage, motherhood. And since it's been recently demonstrated that calcite bone is such a great substrate for strontium isotope analysis, we've tried to expand this angle of the project, and we're able to get funding for the FWF project, Unlocking the Secrets of Cremated Human Remains. So building on the thousands of graves that were excavating during rescue excavations in the Austrian Traisen Valley in the 1980s and 90s, we aim to get further insights into temporality, gendered mobility, and family relations in late Bronze Age Austria, asking some very specific questions. Was the change of burial rites at the onset of the late Bronze Age a local development or triggered by newcomers? Did the deposition of cremated human remains take place directly after the cremation, or can we identify some sort of time gap that suggests bone curation? Can we detect gendered patterns of mobility and migration? And did co-buried individuals grow up in the same or in different environments? This time we apply a number of scientific methods to get the maximum out of information from cremated human remains. So we combine state-of-the-art osteological age and sex assessment of cremated human remains under the direction of Dr. Lukas Waltenberger now. And we use strontium isotope analysis of human remains and compare plant samples. We're planning a large amount of radiocarbon dates directly from the cremated bones, but also from animal bones in the same graves. And we analyze gender, age, and status based on grave groups. One of the cemeteries we're currently working on, Franzhausen-Kockeron, contain the feeding vessel in the child's grave. And this was one of the vessels that we tested for organic residue in combination with, in collaboration with Julie Dunny and Richard Ebershed from the chemistry department in Bristol. The small and very delicate nature of the feeding vessels did necessitate developing a specific sampling strategy. So in this picture, you see the director of the prehistoric department and his late wife, Daniela, discussing the best sampling location with the restorer. Sadly, Daniela died unexpectedly last year. We collaborated a lot with her. She shared her interest in mothers and children in prehistory and was also very supportive of her work. So, I'll now hand over to Roderick Salisbury, who's giving you some more details on the feeding vessels.
So we were required to come up with a sampling strategy that doesn't destroy the vessels. Obviously, most people don't want you to smash off pieces of their museum exhibits. And the traditional way of extracting data from this was to clean a sherd, break off a piece, and crush it. You don't really need 10 grams or more of powdered ceramic to do residue analysis. you can do it with less than 1 gram. So the method we came up with, which was available in the previous slide, was to have Julie grind off a small bit of the inside of the slide and then collect this. Now, it's not so easy to find feeding vessels securely contextualized to be from child burials. We had the one from Franzhausen. We have access to other feeding vessels that were found in various sites. But this new method we had made it at least the vessels accessible once we found somebody that had some. And some colleagues from Germany found 3 in Bavaria. One from Dietfurt Tennisplatz, that's on the bottom of the screen, with a child. Another one from Dietfurt Tankstelle. These are both Hallstatt sample. Hallstatt ones. This was found in the pot, which you can also see. Does this work? Yeah. So in the pot was this longer one, and then a fragmented one from Augsburg that was from a late Bronze Age cremation burial. And with these, and this is what the diagrams on the opposite side of the screen show you, using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, it's possible to differentiate milk fats from body fats, and further to differentiate ruminant fats like cows and sheep and things from other animals, pigs and humans. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of information on human breast milk, but we do have information on the rest of those things. Explain to me how I make this actually work. I'm obviously incapable of doing this. I see what you're doing. Very good. Okay, so Julie took samples, and some vessels went to meet her in Bristol to identify these organic molecules from liquids that may have been preserved in the ceramic matrix. And after the ceramics have been sampled, the lipid biomarkers, or the biomolecules, are extracted from them using acidified methanol. Methanol is good because lots of compounds dissolve in it, and it's easily evaporated, leaving you with the compound you're interested in. These extractants, the total lipid extractants that are from this, are then further reduced to create fatty acid methyl esters, which we can introduce to the mass spectrometry. The first stage is just plain gas chromatography mass spec. This helps us categorize the molecules we find into categories like animal fats or plasticizers and contaminants from curation and restoration, which unfortunately we found from a few samples, but not these good ones, not these highly contextualized ones. And then those residues that are undoubtedly degraded animal fats were introduced to gas chromatography combustion isotope ratio mass spec. And the key part of that is the isotope ratio part, where we can differentiate between carbon 13, carbon 12, and the actual the fatty acid chains within these. So our extracts of these 3 vessels in particular were dominated by palmitic and stearic fatty acids that are typical of degraded animal fats. We also found some slightly shorter chain fatty acids. These are almost never detected in archaeological samples and probably derived from very fresh animal milk. And exactly why these are preserved isn't clear in this case, and they are preserved in very high amounts, but they're definitely present. So this is a little bit of added support to the interpretation, which is that the fatty acids from Dietfurt Tankstelle and Augsburg are definitely plot along the ruminant dairy range. So this is animal milk fats from cows or sheep or goats or what have you. And the one from Dietfurt Tennisplatz plots between that and non-ruminant fats, with, for example, pig or human milk, for example. So this indicates some minor mixing of the non-ruminant stuff with the dairy products. Conclusion, in any case, is we have the first ever positively identified baby bottles. And we were able to put this in, publish this in Nature in 2019. Now, our confirmation that these feeding vessels were used with breast milk substitutes instead of, for example, some weaning material like gruel or porridge or something has major implications for mother-child relations and therefore for other social relations. successful breastfeeding requires that the mom and the baby are together all the time, or almost all the time. Using baby bottles, feeding vessels, with a milk substitute, or even potentially with the mother's expressed milk, means that anybody can help take care of the child. This strengthens social bonds. The father could be involved, other pregnant women, aged and infirm grandmothers and great-grandmothers can be involved. And this frees the woman, as well as making social bonds, frees the woman for other things, like she can have a break, but also she can be more involved with other productive activities. And this is really important. We know prehistorically or ethnographically that, and probably prehistorically, that women were probably instrumental in driving plant domestication. That's a lot easier to do when you don't have to carry the kid around with you. They're also involved in a lot of other productive activities. And this is also interesting that in the Bronze Age and early Iron Age, this is a period when you have an increasing centralization and urbanization, as we see in the settlement record, and increasing female mobility that might be partly related to her ability to step aside and let someone else spend part of the day taking care of the children. And in 2020, we published another paper, this one in Childhood in the Past, and that enabled us to involve a longer paper with a bit more archaeological content. We're quite pleased with the results. I think that's it for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about childhood diet, and in particular, our work to try to better characterize childhood diet using non-destructive methods, and focusing in particular on dental wear analysis. And so the reconstruction of masturbatory behavior, because this relates, the physical properties of diet obviously relate quite strongly to the introduction of solid foods to children and harder foods later on in childhood. And this was the topic of my PhD, which was submitted and successfully defended last year. So I'm going to present a little bit what we could tell. Okay. On the mouse. Good. So how do we get information about diet from dental wear? Essentially, the masturbatory cycle will vary slightly depending on what kind of food is being processed and chewed. And this is going to leave traces both at the microscopic scale that can be measured on the enamel, and also it's going to lead to macroscopic alterations to the tooth, so first the obliteration of the cusps and then dentine exposure. And so there are methods that have been developed over the last few decades, and they're increasingly improving to use imaging and imaging methods and measurements to try to track the progression of dental wear and compare it between individuals and groups, and discuss obviously how this relates to the masturbatory cycle and diet. So we published 2 papers on the methodology for dental wear measurement, and in particular how this needs to be adapted for studying childhood diet. So the first paper was on dental microwear. We looked at different locations on the enamel surface and looked at the variability of measurements for each individual and compared the difference within and between individuals, and discussed the relevance of this for measurement procedure. And then we also worked on the second paper, we worked on macroscopic dental wear. So we developed a new way of measuring and tracking the progression of macroscopic dental wear, which suited our particular needs, based on using an intraoral scanner to create a 3D model of the dentition. And then we can measure different features of the occlusal topography, which change as dental wear progresses. So here you have a graph with the mesial interior slope angle. This is one of the measurements we have. And you see this angle increasing as children get older. And so what we looked at, in particular, so we're working on a paper now about the Franzhausen children, the early Bronze Age children. And there's a few things, we seem to have a display problem, but it's not too bad. Essentially, what we can tell from the dental wear compared to medieval samples is that there's actually more dental wear than in later medieval samples, and definitely a lot more dental wear occurring during childhood than compared to present-day samples. And there's also quite a low prevalence of tooth decay. And so we can conclude from this the Bronze Age diet was generally quite hard and coarse and non-karyogenic. If we look a bit more in detail, so here these are measurements of dentine exposure. So we look at the occlusal surface and the areas of exposed dentine, and what proportion of the occlusal surface is occupied by these areas of exposed dentine, which can be measured. And there I've plotted dentine exposure for different teeth and the measurement uncertainty associated with, the age estimation uncertainty. And what you can see, obviously, is that dental wear is increasing, the amount of exposed dentine is increasing with age. Makes sense. But also that individuals of the same age can have vastly different amounts of exposed dentine. And so we can talk about age-dependent and independent dental wear variation in this sample. And this is quite interesting because it means that there's that some children they would arrive at a certain age and would experience a lot more dental wear, and this is likely related to differences in diet. And we don't know if these differences in diet are differences that occurred over the centuries that the cemetery was being occupied, or whether these are differences in diet between children who were living at the same time, or both combined. But we can say that not every child in this community experienced the same amount of dental wear. And this is backed up by measuring dental wear in multiple ways using both topography and dentine exposure. And we also have some measurements for microwear, but not so many because of sample preservation. What we do have suggests that the diet for younger children was softer, and then the diet for older children had more hard elements in it that might have been sourced outside the domestic setting. We also have the possibility, a possible case of gendered childhood diet that still needs to be investigated further. But so we have this case where these dental wear in the first deciduous molar there's a little bit more dental wear in the female children than in the male children. And so this could be due to differences in weaning practices or weaning foods between both genders. So that needs to be investigated.
Thank you. And you will have noticed this is the same sample set where we did the sex identification with peptides. So the ages and stages of childhood were a topic that we engaged in by hosting the annual International Conference of the Society for the Study of Childhood in the Past at the Natural History Museum in Vienna in 2018. We discussed differences of biological, chronological, and social ages, and cross-culturally compared the major thresholds in a child's life. So Doris and I subsequently published an edited volume on this topic with RQ Press. In some cases, it's also very useful to get more detailed age estimations by applying multiple methods. Again, in cooperation with Fabian Kanz, we applied tooth cementum annulation, or TCA, to refine age estimations. So in this method, a thin section of the root of a tooth is then evaluated under the microscope, and much like in a tree, a light and a dark ring of tooth cementum are added each year to the root of the tooth. And counting and measuring these rings and adding them to the average age of tooth eruption can then be used to determine the chronological age of death. So in this triple burial, for example, TCA suggests an even larger age gap between the buried male individual and the young mother than the morphology alone would suggest. We organized a workshop on TCA and cremated human remains in 2017 to gather opinions about applying TCA to cremated human remains. And if the roots of teeth survive the funerary pyre, the enamel is normally not preserved. TCA can give a minimum age of death or help to recognize multiple individuals. So one example of a successful application is this wonderful late Bronze Age grave from Brno. Our colleagues in Brno excavated this a few years ago. It's a body-sized burial chamber with a sword, 2 spare heads, bone, 4 tusks, spare teeth, everything you like, and 2.8 kilos of cremated remains. The anthropological analysis showed at least 2 adults being present and 1 fetus. And we could differentiate these 2 adults by the different ages via tooth cementum annulation. So in the bottom, you see immediately that there's a lot of small lines. So this indicates a very high age at death. One is estimated, this individual is estimated at about 56 years, the other at 40 years. So this confirms that it could have been the double burial of an older man and a pregnant woman. The age of first motherhood is, of course, also of crucial importance for understanding how motherhood was socially embedded. We noticed that there are some instances of early Bronze Age teenage moms in the archaeological record, where, again, we tried to use TCA as a second aging approach. The morphological characteristics of this individual buried with fetal remains speak for an age at death of 14-15. The TCA age is a little bit higher with 17.5 years. So we compiled a list of all published instances of women who died pregnant or with a fetus found in the pelvic area. And we found that in the Central European Iron Age, the age of first motherhood is generally a little bit higher. In the Iron Age, the iconographic evidence also suggests more of a differentiation between people whose reproductive potential is emphasized and people depicted without sexual features. With the upper strata of society, sexuality also appears very tightly controlled. The cedula from Pieve del Pago illustrates courtship, sex in a variety of positions, marital sex indicated by the missionary position and the bed, and finally the outcome and at birth. And what is crucial here is also that sex is not a private act, but it takes place under the eyes of witnesses. The mother is always certain, the father not so much, in the absence of paternity tests. So it's probably the only way to ensure biological relatedness of the father, which at that point has become a major concern. Citula von Montebelluna is one of the only ones where we see a female traveler, perhaps a woman changing residency after marriage. Again, we have a sex scene under observation and 2 women spinning together. They've been interpreted as woman with a mother-in-law. So sadly, we haven't yet managed to bring the Iron Age data on pelvic features together with the archaeological context and interpret them properly. But we've gathered the data, and I have about 25 more years before retirement. So there's plenty of unfinished business that will keep us all occupied in the future. But sort of to sum it up, I think we've learned a lot during these 5 years. We've achieved a lot, much more than we originally thought. And the project often went into slightly different directions than originally intended. But one of my favorite bits was learning about these new cutting-edge methods and trying to apply them to meaningful case studies. So, last week, I organized a virtual roundtable and on the archaeology of motherhood and matricentric feminism. We had 18 papers on motherhood research with over 100 registered participants. We can also say we have achieved one goal: to bring attention to motherhood as a topic worth investigating, a topic that has multiple methodologies, multiple approaches, a topic that links the biological aspect of pregnancy, parturition, and breastfeeding with the identity change that women experience when becoming a mother, and the ideological and social aspects of childcare. And this wouldn't have been possible without a fantastic team, a great host institution, and many wonderful collaborators. So I'm truly very thankful to everyone involved and to the generous funding of the ERC that also made the value of Mothers to Society happen. Thank you very much.